Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm Rachel Troutman, Assistant State Public Defender in the Death Penalty Division. Together with John Q. Lewis of Jones Day and David Mills of the Mills Law Office, I am counsel for Kevin Keith. Mr. Keith is an innocent man. He is scheduled to be executed on September 15, 2010, for a crime he did not commit. Tomorrow, we will appear before the Ohio Parole Board and urge the board to recommend that Governor Strickland grant him clemency. Innocent people can get executed unless people of good conscience do something to stop it. Today, we are announcing the support of more than 30 former federal and state judges and prosecutors, nearly 60 innocence projects and legal organizations, over 100 faith leaders from denominations across Ohio, 13 leading eyewitness experts, and thousands of supporters from Ohio and across the country who are all calling on the Ohio Parole Board and Governor Strickland to grant clemency to Kevin Keith. 13 years after Mr. Keith's trial, we discovered new evidence that demonstrates his innocence. The evidence that shows Mr. Keith's innocence has never been heard by a court in its entirety. Here are 4 things that you need to know about Mr. Keith's case. First, the eyewitness identification used to convict Mr. Keith was mistaken and wholly unreliable. Second, new evidence shows that another suspect admitted to being paid to commit the crimes for which Mr. Keith now stands to be executed. Third, Mr. Keith has an alibi supported by 4 witnesses. And fourth, there is no DNA or forensic evidence that connects Mr. Keith to this crime. The main evidence used to convict Mr. Keith was the erroneous eyewitness identification of one of the surviving victims of the crime, Richard Warren. Mr. Warren initially told 4 witnesses that he did not know who shot him and the shooter was wearing a mask. He was questioned right after the shooting by the police, and in his first police statement, he had no first name and no last name. The next day, however, the police provided Mr. Warren a name array of Kevin's and showed him a suggestive photo lineup where Mr. Keith's face was larger than the others. Mr. Warren was instructed to pick him out. Mr. Warren then identified Mr. Keith as the perpetrator. Another witness, who also survived the shooting, excluded by photo and name Mr. Keith. The circumstances that caused Mr. Warren to name Kevin are a mystery, and they're very troubling. And it's only gotten more troubling over the years. Instead of shedding more light on them, it's gotten more muddled. The state has now procured an affidavit from Nurse Amy Petrick in which she recants her 2007 affidavit, that affidavit stating she was not given a name by Mr. Warren. There's still no explanation for why the nurse is identified as Amy Gimmets on the tape, at trial, and in prosecutorial documents. The procedures under which Mr. Warren identified Mr. Keith would not be permitted today. In recognition of the inherent unreliability of eyewitness identification, Governor Strickland recently signed Senate Bill 77 into law. Senator Goodman was a sponsor of Senate Bill 77, and he recently addressed the unreliability of the eyewitness identification in Mr. Keith's case. He sent a letter to the governor urging him to grant clemency to Mr. Keith. If Senate Bill 77 would have been in place in 1994, I strongly believe that Mr. Keith would never have been convicted. It is the sole evidence left against him. We have also uncovered new evidence of another suspect who admitted to the crime for which Mr. Keith stands to be executed. Before the shooting occurred, he stated that he was paid $15,000 to carry out this crime. This other suspect has a violent history, and he has provided contradictory alibis, unlike Mr. Keith, who has a solid alibi supported by 4 eyewitnesses. No jury has ever heard the evidence about that other suspect and his initial statements that he was paid to commit the crime, which was illegally suppressed by the state and could have changed the outcome in Mr. Keith's case. The new evidence supports what Mr. Keith has said from day one. He is innocent. According to 4 witnesses, Mr. Keith was miles away from the crime scene at the time of the murders. There's no DNA, there's no forensic evidence, there's no Amy Gimmets, there's no case. The Ohio Parole Board must recommend, and Governor Strickland must grant clemency for Mr. Keith. Any other result would be irreversible, sickening, and a tragic mistake. We are fortunate to have with us today prominent supporters of clemency for Mr. Keith from Ohio and across the country. Next, you will hear from Jennifer Bergeron from the Ohio Innocence Project, Keith Finley, who is the president of the National Innocence Network, which includes more than 60 innocence projects from around the country and beyond. Jennifer Thompson, a woman who survived a rape and now speaks out courageously about misidentifying the perpetrator in her case. Dale Johnston, an Ohio man who spent 7 years in prison for murders he did not commit. Jim Petro, former Attorney General of Ohio. And Tim Young, the Director of the Office of the Ohio Public Defender. Tim will close this event and will lead our delegation to deliver letters of support for Mr. Keith to the governor's office. And here with us today are additional supporters, including Charles Keith, Mr. Keith's brother, Jim Tobin, president of the Catholic Conference of Ohio, who, along with over 100 faith leaders and organizations, submitted a letter today supporting clemency for Mr. Keith, Jerry Freewell from the Catholic Conference of Columbus, Tom Smith from the Ohio Council of Churches, Robert McClendon, who was exonerated by DNA after spending 17 years in prison in Ohio due to eyewitness misidentification, and Melinda Elkins Dawson, who, together with the Ohio Innocence Project and Jim Petro, exonerated Clarence Elkins. Now I will turn it over to Jennifer Bergeron from the Ohio Innocence Project.